All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to dive into a surprisingly tricky accounting rule, one that has a massive impact on how a company values its products. And really, it all boils down to one simple question.
Okay, so imagine you're running a factory. One month, things are, well, they're slow. The next month, you're absolutely slammed. Now here's the question. Should the stuff you made during that slow month actually cost more? You know, just because fewer items had to soak up all those fixed costs like rent. On the surface, it kind of makes sense, right? But trust me, that way of thinking can create some huge problems for a business.
And this right here, this shows the dilemma perfectly. You see, if we just take our factory rent and divide it by how many things we made, well, in a slow month, each unit gets a higher chunk of that cost. And that's simple math. It leads to totally unstable prices and makes your inventory valuation an absolute mess. No way to run a business.
So this is what we're calling the production puzzle. We're going to dig into why this even happens. And the culprit? It's those stubborn fixed costs. You know, things like the factory rent or the depreciation on your big machines. The costs that stay the same whether you churn out one widget or a million of them.
And that brings us to the hero of our story today, the normal capacity rule. It's part of an accounting standard called Ind AS 2, and it's the one principle designed to solve this exact puzzle and bring some much-needed stability to how we cost our products.
Okay, so what on earth is normal capacity? Well, think of it as the average amount of stuff your factory expects to make over a bunch of different periods. It smooths out all the crazy busy months and the super slow ones. It's kind of like the factory's normal, reliable cruising speed. And that average, that becomes the baseline we use for everything.
And why do we do this? Well, the whole point here is to stop your inventory's value from swinging all over the place just because you had one slow month or one crazy rush order. It's all about making sure the product's cost reflects the factory's normal efficiency, not the temporary chaos of the day-to-day.
All right, let's put this into practice. Let's look at a real-world scenario. First up, we'll tackle the most common situation. What happens when production takes a nosedive and the factory hits a slump?
Okay, it's a pretty straightforward three-step process. First things first, we figure out our overhead rate. But, and this is key, we base it on our normal capacity, not the low number we actually hit. So let's say our fixed overhead is 1,500 rupees and our normal capacity is 7,500 hours. That gives us a nice, stable rate. Then, step 2. We take that normal rate and apply it only to the hours we actually worked. Let's say 6,500 hours. That allocates 1,300 rupees to the products. But wait, what happens to the rest?
And that's step 3. The leftover 200 rupees, it gets expensed right away. It doesn't get buried in the cost of the product. The accounting rule basically says, look, that 200 rupees is the cost of your factory being idle, and that's an expense for this period. You can't hide it in your inventory value.
Okay, so that's what happens when things are slow. But what about the flip side? What happens when the factory is running at full tilt and production is way, way higher than normal? Well, that creates a completely different kind of puzzle.
So here's the problem. If we just stuck with our normal rate, we'd actually end up allocating more costs to our products than we really spend. And you can't do that. You can't just invent costs out of thin air. So the rule says you've got to adjust. In this situation, you pretty much ignore the normal rate and use the actual rate instead.
So how do we do that? Simple. We take our total actual overhead, let's say it's 1.5 million rupees, and we divide it by our super high actual production, maybe 750,000 units. And what that does is it gives us a new, lower rate, in this case, 2 rupees per unit. This makes sure our inventory value is a true reflection of what it actually costs to make everything. Okay, so let's zoom out. How does all this maneuvering actually affect the final cost of one single item? This is where you can really see how smart this rule is.
Let's just break it down nice and simple. When your actual production is less than normal, you stick with that steady, predictable normal rate. This keeps your unit cost stable because the cost of that idle time gets expensed on its own. Now, when your actual production is more than normal, you switch to a lower actual rate. And this means your unit cost actually goes down, which makes sense, right? It reflects the fact that your factory was running super efficiently.
Okay, so you might be thinking, why all this hassle? Why do we even care about this? Well, why does having a stable, predictable product cost matter so much in the real world?
You know, when you boil it all down, it comes back to one core principle of accounting. You simply cannot value your inventory for more than it actually costs you to make. That's it. And this whole normal capacity rule, it's just creating the guardrails to make sure that whether production is booming or busting, the final number you put on that inventory is fair and, most importantly, accurate.
And this is really the final thought I want to leave you with. I mean, just think about it for a second. If the cost of your product is bouncing up and down every single month, how on earth are you supposed to set a reliable sales price? How can you tell if you're even profitable? How do you make any smart business decisions? See, this rule isn't just some boring accounting thing. It's about creating the stable, reliable data you absolutely need to run a business well.